The sun was warm and generous, spilling over the concrete shoulders of the downtown plaza. It was that perfect hour of the day when the morning's frantic rush had softened into the gentle hum of a lunch break. The air smelled of roasted nuts from a street cart, the faint exhaust of city buses, and the expensive perfume of women walking by in brisk, confident strides. Pigeons strutted near the feet of outdoor diners, hoping for a fallen crumb, while the distant wail of a saxophone floated from a performer near the fountain. David Vance moved through this world like a calm current in a busy river. He was a man who seemed to carry his own quiet weather with him, an atmosphere of peace that the city's chaos couldn't quite penetrate. He was in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair trimmed neatly and a face that showed the faint maps of smile lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore a simple, dark blazer over a light-colored shirt, kind of outfit that spoke of comfort and quality without shouting for attention. In his hand he carried a worn leather briefcase, its surface soft from years of use. He was on his way to meet an old colleague for coffee, simple pleasure he always looked forward to. As he walked, he let the city wash over him. He watched a young woman laughing into her phone, her expression pure and unguarded. He saw a construction worker take a long drink from a water bottle, his face tilted toward the sky. These small human moments were the threads that made up the fabric of the city he loved, or city he had dedicated his life to serving. He wasn't thinking about work today, though. He was just a man enjoying a moment of peace on a beautiful afternoon. Up ahead, crosswalk signal was a solid, glowing red hand. A small crowd of people had already gathered on the corner, waiting patiently. David was about 10 feet from the curb, and he was looking across the street, already spotting the familiar awning of the cafe. In his mind, he was already tasting the rich coffee. He took one more step, then another, his thoughts miles away from the simple mechanics of crossing the street. He didn't notice the light begin to change, or the "Don't walk" sign blinking to life. He simply stepped off the curb into the street, a common, harmless mistake made 1,000 times a day in that very spot. "Hey, hold it right there." The voice was sharp and loud, cracking through the gentle lunch hour hum like a whip. It was not a friendly shout. It was an order, filled with an immediate and aggressive authority. David stopped, one foot on the asphalt, one still on the sidewalk. He turned, a little startled, and saw the source of the voice. 2 police officers were standing by the plaza's central monument. The one who had shouted was young, maybe late 20s, with a lean, muscular build that seemed strained against his uniform, as if it were too small to contain all his energy. His face was set in a hard line, his jaw tight. This was Officer Mike Dunn. His partner, standing a few paces behind him, was a woman with a calmer, more observant face. Officer Jenna Lopes. She had her hands resting casually on her duty belt, but her eyes were watchful, and a subtle frown creased her brow as she looked at her partner. Dunn had already started walking toward David, skate stiff with purpose. He wasn't just walking, he was advancing. His eyes were locked onto David, and in them there was no concern or caution, only a predatory focus. He had been bored. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, watching people, feeling the uniform on his skin like a suit that wasn't being used to its full potential. He was a hammer, and he had been desperately looking for a nail. David, with his simple misstep, was the perfect one. "See that?" Dunn asked, his voice still booming. He didn't wait for an answer. He pointed a gloved finger at the glowing red hand on the traffic light pole, the big red sign. "It means don't walk, or maybe they don't teach that where you come from." A ripple of quiet moved through the nearby pedestrians. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. People began to sense a show was starting. David felt a flush of embarrassment, but his primary instinct was to de-escalate. It was his natural way. He raised his empty hand in a peaceful gesture. "My apologies, officer," he said. His voice was smooth and even, a stark contrast to Dunn's. "That was my mistake completely. Expected a nod, maybe a gruff, be more careful. That's how these things usually go." But Officer Dunn wasn't interested in a simple resolution. He wanted a submission. He saw not a man who had made a mistake, but a simple man in nice clothes who probably felt entitled, who probably thought the rules didn't apply to him. Dunn saw the blazer, the briefcase, the calm demeanor, and it fueled something inside him. Lost in thought? Dunn repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He took another step closer, now well within David's personal space. He looked David up and down, a slow, insulting sweep of his eyes. Yeah, I bet. Got somewhere real important to be? A big meeting where you get to tell everybody else what to do? David didn't answer. He could feel the eyes of the gathering crowd on him. He saw a few phones appear, held discreetly at chest level, their cameras silently recording. His calm demeanor remained, but a new, steely resolve began to form behind his eyes. He understood this had nothing to do with jaywalking anymore. This was about power. Guys like you, Dunn continued, his voice dropping slightly but becoming no less intense. I see you every single day. You walk around with your fancy briefcases, acting like you own the place. But the rules are the same for everybody, see? He tapped the red hand sign with his knuckle. This applies to you too. David noticed the female officer Lopes shift her weight from one foot to the other. She glanced at the ground, then at the growing crowd, and then back at her partner. Her expression was one of clear discomfort. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it. It was a small, silent moment of discord, but David saw it. He knew he wasn't the only one who thought this was wrong. Look at me when I'm talking to you, Dunn barked, misreading David's steady gaze as defiance. David met his eyes. His own expression was unreadable, a placid lake that held deep, unspoken currents. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch. It was a powerful quiet, and it seemed to make Dunn even more agitated. The officer felt his control slipping. He had come out here expecting a quick, easy display of authority, something to show everyone who was in charge. Instead, this man was refusing to give him the fear or the anger he wanted. He was just watching. The crowd was bigger now. A semicircle of onlookers had formed, creating a small, invisible stage. The sound of the city had faded into the background for them. All that mattered was the drama unfolding in the center. Dunn felt the weight of their attention. He knew he couldn't back down now. He had committed. He had made this man a public example, and now he had to see it through. He needed to escalate. He needed to establish his dominance in a way that couldn't be ignored. All right, that's enough, Dunn said, his voice hardening into official command. Let's see some identification now. He held out his hand, his palm up, his fingers wiggling impatiently. David looked at the outstretched hand. He looked back at the young man's face, which was flushed with a mixture of anger and insecurity. He could feel the dozens of phones trained on him, capturing every moment. He knew this moment was no longer his own. It was now public property. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his response here, in this plaza, would define everything. He slowly reached inside his jacket for his wallet. The air in the little circle of space had grown thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Every word from the officer's mouth felt like a drop of rain. David could feel the collective breath of the crowd, a silent, watching presence that amplified the tension. He reached into his jacket, the movement slow and deliberate. His fingers brushed against the familiar worn leather of his wallet. He wasn't nervous. He was calculating. He had been in situations like this before, not personally, but he had studied them, broken them down in trainings and debriefings. He knew the psychology of a show of force. He knew how quickly pride could turn a situation dangerous. He pulled out his wallet, simple brown leather fold, and opened it. He slid out his driver's license, a small plastic rectangle that suddenly felt like the most important document in the world. He held it out, not with a flick of the wrist like a frustrated teenager might, but with a steady, quiet dignity. He offered it to the young officer as if it were a privilege, not a demand. Officer Dunn snatched it from his grasp. The movement was sharp and aggressive. He held it up close to his face, his thumb nearly covering the photo. He squinted at it, not like someone trying to verify information, but like a connoisseur looking for a flaw in a piece of art. David Vance, Dunn read aloud, drawing the name out, making it sound foreign and slightly ridiculous. That's a fancy name. He flipped it over, as if the back might hold some secret clue. Says you live on the West End, must be real nice up there. He let the comment hang in the air. A clear jab meant to highlight a difference in class and status. He wasn't just talking to a jaywalker anymore. He was addressing a symbol of everything he felt was wrong with the city, the divide between the people who ran things and the people like him, who had to clean up the mess. He handed the license back, but not in a way that allowed David to take it easily. He held it pinched between his thumb and forefinger, forcing David to reach for it. It was a small, petty power play, but it was effective. It made David have to come to him to ask for his own identity back. As David's fingers touched the plastic, the radio on Dunn's shoulder crackled to life. A sudden burst of static and electronic noise that made everyone jump. The dispatcher's voice, clear and professional, cut through the tension. "Central units, be advised," she said. "All central units, be advised." Dunn straightened up instinctively, his officer training taking over for a moment. "Commissioner Vance is running ahead of schedule. He is not in a marked vehicle and is considered off-duty. ETA back to headquarters is 1345. Report any civilian interactions with the David Vance," matching his description immediately. The words hung in the air, a strange official broadcast that seemed disconnected from the scene. For a moment, no one reacted. The crowd just listened, processing the information. David's expression didn't change, but something deep inside him settled. It was the sound of a net being cast. Dunn, however, was completely oblivious. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure dismissal. He glanced over at his partner Lopes, who was now standing stock-still, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly agape as she stared at the man in front of them. Dunn didn't see the shock on her face. He only saw an opportunity for more mockery. "Did you hear that?" he said to the man who was, in fact, the subject of that very call. He jerked a thumb toward his shoulder. "Commissioner Vance? Some big shot? Probably the same guy who lives in your fancy neighborhood?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, sneering whisper. "You know what? Maybe this commissioner should spend more time out here on the streets. See what it's really like. Instead of sitting in his fancy office, telling guys like me how to do our jobs." The irony was so thick it was almost comical. David stood there, the man who signed Dunn's paychecks. The man who had authored half the procedures in the officer's manual, being lectured on how he should do his job. A very small, very dangerous spark of humor lit up in David's mind, but he immediately snuffed it out. This was not a time for humor. This was a time for control. He could feel the shift in the crowd. They weren't just watching anymore. They were listening, connecting the dots. A few people in the front row exchanged wide-eyed glances. Someone gasped quietly. Phones were held higher now, not just recording, but aiming. It was as if they knew they were capturing something extraordinary. Dunn, completely lost in his own performance, had no idea. He was so intoxicated by his own authority that he couldn't see the reality playing out right in front of him. He looked David up and down one last time, a final, dismissive sweep. "You know what?" he said, his voice loud again, projecting to the audience he had gathered. "You should learn a thing or two from your namesake, pal. Starting with some respect for the law." And there it was. The word respect. It was the core of it all. David Vance finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or argue. He spoke in the same calm, even tone he had used from the beginning, but this time there was a new quality to it. It was the quiet strength of steel. "Respect," he said, his voice clear and precise, "is a two-way street, officer." He paused, letting the words land. He looked directly into Dunn's eyes, and for the first time, the officer seemed to falter. He looked away for a split second, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He had expected a reaction on Gar, fear, apology, but he had not expected this. He had not expected to be taught a lesson in the middle of his own public shaming. David continued, his voice still low, but carrying an immense weight. "It is earned, not demanded." The power in that sentence was palpable. It was a statement of absolute truth, spoken with a conviction that went far beyond a simple argument on a street corner. It was a truth that resonated with every single person watching. They all knew it, in their bones. Respect wasn't something you could force out of someone with a badge or a loud voice. It was something you built with honesty and fairness. This officer was building the exact opposite. Dunn stood there, speechless for the first time since the confrontation began. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a machine that had suddenly been unplugged. He was so completely invested in the idea that he was the teacher, that he was the one with all the power and the knowledge, that the reality of the situation, the fact that he was being calmly and completely dismantled by the man he was trying to belittle, was simply not computing. His partner, Lopes, finally seemed to find her voice. She took a half step forward. "Mike," she said, her voice soft but urgent. It was a warning, but Dunn was locked in. His pride had taken over completely. To back down now, in front of all these people, after he had said so much, would be a total and utter humiliation. He couldn't do it. He had to regain control of the narrative. He had to prove, once and for all, who was in charge here. "You don't get to lecture me about respect," Dunn sputtered, his voice regaining some of its angry volume. "You're the one who broke the law. You're the one who's standing here giving me an attitude, who's trying to rebuild the wall brick by brick, but it was crumbling around him." David didn't engage with the anger. He simply held his ground, his presence a silent, unshakable force. He looked at Dunn, not with anger, but with something that almost looked like pity, and that, more than anything else, was what truly broke the young officer. That was the moment the distant wail of a siren began to cut through the air. It wasn't a loud, urgent siren, but a single, whooping whoop, getting closer with each passing second. Everyone in the plaza turned their heads toward the sound. A black, unmarked police sedan with sleek, low-profile lights in its grille was pushing its way through a small gap in the traffic. It wasn't driving recklessly, but its purpose was clear. It was coming for this spot. Dunn saw it, and a flicker of hope crossed his face. Back up. He was getting back up. He thought they were coming to help him handle this uncooperative citizen. Straightened his shoulders, a smug smile beginning to form on his lips. He thought he had one. He had no idea the car was coming for him. The siren grew closer, a sound that cut through the city's background noise like a scalpel. It was a single, authoritative whoop, then another, a signal that commanded attention without causing panic. The black sedan, moving with a confident grace, ignored the rules everyone else followed, gliding through a yellow light and pulling up to the curb with a gentle, practiced ease. It was a car that was used to being given the right of way. For Officer Dunn, the arrival of this unmarked car felt like a cavalry charge. He saw it as validation. His partner had called for assistance, and now it was here. The cavalry had arrived to help him tame this defiant, lecture-giving citizen. A smug, self-satisfied smile began to play on his lips. He even took a small, theatrical step back, as if to give the arriving officers room to work. He was preparing to hand over the difficult subject, to let reinforcements deliver the final. A forceful message. He watched the driver's side door open, expecting to see one of his own, a fellow street cop ready to back him up. But the person who stepped out was not what he expected. It was a woman, tall and formidable, wearing the sharp, pressed uniform of a deputy chief. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun, and her eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, swept the scene not with panic, but with a swift clinical assessment. This was Deputy Chief Ramos, and she did not even glance in Dunn's direction. Her focus was absolute. Her eyes bypassed the crowd, ignored Officer Dunn and his nervous partner, and locked on to the one person she was there to see, the man in the simple blazer who stood in the center of it all. She moved with a purpose, her polished black boots clicking sharply on the pavement. She walked past Dunn as if he were a park statue, invisible and irrelevant. The air grew heavy with a new kind of tension, the kind that wasn't about a jaywalking ticket, but about something far more consequential. Deputy Chief Ramos stopped a few feet from David Vance and, without a moment's hesitation, snapped to attention. She brought her right hand up in a crisp, formal salute that was so perfect, so full of deference, that it seemed to suck all the air out of the plaza. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. stripped of any emotion except for the most profound respect. "Commissioner Vance, sir," she said. Dispatch reported an officer interaction. "Is everything all right here?" The two words Commissioner Vance hit Officer Dunn like a physical blow. They hung in the air, glowing with a terrible, blinding light. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the ground shifting beneath his feet. He heard a collective gasp from the crowd, a sound that was both sharp and soft, like 1,000 people drawing a breath at once. He saw phones lower, then raise again, held more steadily, as if the people filming understood they were now capturing history, not just a street conflict. His mind, so full of righteous confidence just moments before, became a frantic, scrambling mess. "Commissioner." The word replayed in his head, echoing off the inside of his skull. He thought back to the radio call, the one he had mocked. "Commissioner Vance is running ahead of schedule. Report any civilian interactions with a David Vance matching his description." His eyes darted to the man's face, the face he had been staring at with such contempt. It was the same calm, dignified face, but now it looked completely different. It was the face of a man who had been tested with fire and hadn't even broken a sweat. It was the face of the person who signed his performance reviews, the person who oversaw the entire department, the person whose name was on the side of the building where he went to work every day. The color drained from Dunn's face, sickly, pale white. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The smug smile had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated horror. All the arrogance, all the posturing, all the power he had felt just seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, echoing shell of fear. He risked a glance at his partner, Officer Lopes. She was already looking at him. But her expression was not one of shared horror or sympathy. It was a look of grim, unsurprised disappointment. She had known. She had figured it out the moment the radio call came in. And now, as if to complete her separation from his folly, she took a deliberate half-step away from him, creating a small but significant space between them. She was no longer his partner in this. She was a witness to his downfall. Commissioner Vance did not look at Dunn. He didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction, not a glare, not a word of condemnation. He didn't need to. The scene itself was its own judgment. He kept his gaze fixed on his deputy chief, his posture relaxed. "Everything is under control, Chief Ramos," he said. His voice was still quiet, but now it seemed to carry the weight of a mountain. It was the voice of a man who was not just in control of the situation, but in command of his own emotions. A true display of power. He then, and only then, turned his head to look at the terrified Officer Dunn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words he spoke were simple, but they were delivered with an authority that was absolute and non-negotiable. "Officer Dunn," he said, his voice devoid of any anger, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "You and your partner will return to headquarters immediately." The order was so clean, so direct, that Dunn's body reacted before his mind could. He felt a primal urge to obey, to nod, to say yes, sir. But he was frozen in place, trapped by the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. The commissioner continued, his tone unwavering. "You will report to Internal Affairs. I want a full, detailed report on my desk in 1 hour." The sentence was delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. 1 hour? The time frame was a deliberate surgical cruelty. It gave him just enough time to sweat, to panic, to live in the full, glorious horror of what he had done and what was about to happen to him. "Sir," Deputy Chief Ramos said, her voice still perfectly respectful, but now with an undertone of steel, "allow me to escort them." Commissioner Vance gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "No, Chief," he said. "I have a coffee meeting to get to. I trust you can handle it from here." He turned, and with a smooth, natural movement, he straightened his blazer and picked up his briefcase. He looked at the crowd, and for the first time, he offered a small, reassuring smile, as if to say, "See? Everything is fine." Then, with the deputy chief watching over the two officers, David Vance walked away. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. He simply crossed the street at the crosswalk, this time waiting for the little white man to appear, and continued on his way to the cafe. leaving behind him a young officer whose entire world had just been shattered in the middle of a public plaza. Deputy Chief Ramos turned her attention to the two patrol officers. She looked at Lopes. "Sergeant," she said. Her tone was not a question, but a statement. Lopes had been acting with the sergeant's authority, and now she was being acknowledged for it, even in this terrible moment. "You will drive your vehicle back to headquarters. You will write your own report, separate from Officer Dunn's. You will wait in your lieutenant's office until I personally come to speak with you." Lopes swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, Chief." Her voice was steady, a clear contrast to the man standing beside her. Ramos then fixed her gaze on Officer Dunn. Her expression was cold, devoid of any pity. "And you," she said, "you will not say another word. You will get in the back of my car. You will not look at your phone. You will not speak. You will sit there and you will think. Do you understand me?" Dunn could only manage a weak, pathetic nod. His mouth was dry. His tongue felt like sandpaper. He felt like a child who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Only the cookie jar was the entire police department, and he hadn't just taken a cookie. He had smashed it to pieces. Chief Ramos opened the back door of her sedan. It wasn't the barred, cramped back of a patrol car. It was just a regular car seat, but for Dunn, it felt like a ride in a hearse. He slid into the back, the cool leather feeling like ice against his sweaty skin. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound trapping him in a suffocating silence. Through the tinted window, he could see the faces of the crowd, a sea of judgment. He saw the phones, the little red lights of recording lights still blinking. He saw his partner get into her patrol car, her movements stiff and formal. He was no longer a police officer. He was no longer an authority figure. He was just a man in a cage, a man who had spent an hour demonstrating the very worst of what his profession could be, only to find out his audience was his boss. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the plaza, the crowd, and the ghost of his own arrogance behind him. The drive back to headquarters was the longest and quietest of his entire life. The Internal Affairs office had a smell all its own. It was a mix of old coffee, stale air conditioning, and the faint, lingering scent of fear. It was the smell of consequences. Officer Dunn sat alone in a hard metal chair, the kind of chair that was designed for durability, not comfort. Its back was cold and straight, forcing his posture into a rigid, uncomfortable line. The room itself was small and sterile, painted a color that might once have been called beige, but now just looked tired. There was no window. The only light came from a harsh fluorescent panel in the ceiling, which cast unforgiving shadows and made his skin look sad. He had been sitting here for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it had only been a couple of hours. The ride back to headquarters in the back of the deputy chief's car had been a journey. Through the circles of his own personal hell, the silence in that car had been a living thing, heavy and accusatory. He had replayed every moment, every word, every smug look. He saw himself on a loop in his mind, a loud, ignorant bully, performing for a crowd, completely unaware that his final judge was standing right in front of him after the car had arrived. He was escorted through the back halls of the building he thought he knew. These were corridors he rarely saw, places where the public never went. The faces of the officers he passed were a study in controlled neutrality. But he could feel the currents of information flowing just beneath the surface. Whispers had started the moment he was out of sight. The story, he was sure, was spreading like a virus through the department. Now, in this room, he was left alone with his thoughts and a tablet computer that sat on the metal table in front of him. The screen was lit up, showing a grid of 6 different videos. They were all from different angles, different phones, but they all showed the same thing. They showed him. He watched himself step off the curb, his voice booming. He heard the words, "See that?" The big red sign. Saw himself invade the man's space. His face twisted with a contempt he now recognized as pure insecurity. He couldn't stop watching. It was a form of self-torture, a penance he felt he deserved. He saw the quiet dignity of the man he now knew was Commissioner Vance, a dignity that had only served to fuel his own fire. He saw the crowd gathering, the phones coming out. He saw the smirk on his own face when the radio call came in. the look of absolute, foolish confidence as he mocked his own boss. He saw the moment the deputy chief arrived, the shift in power, the way he just stood there, his brain refusing to connect the dots until the word commissioner had been spoken. He watched the color drain from his own face on the video. He looked pathetic. He looked broken. He reached out to pause the video, but his hand was trembling so badly he couldn't manage the touchscreen. He just let it play, the audio a low murmur in the quiet room, a constant reminder of his own stupidity. The arrogance, the prejudice, the sheer hubris of it all. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had revealed something rotten inside him. And he had done it in front of the entire city. After what felt like days, the door to the room opened. It wasn't an investigator or a uniformed officer. It was a woman in a civilian suit, holding a thin file. She didn't introduce herself. She simply walked in, placed the file on the table, and looked at him with an expression of detached professionalism. "Officer Dunn," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "The commissioner is ready to see you now." He was led out of the sterile room and down a long, carpeted hallway. This was the executive floor. The air here was different. It was quieter, the sounds of the busy precinct muffled by thick walls and heavy doors. The paintings on the walls were of past police commissioners and historic moments in the city's history. This was the heart of the institution, a place he had only ever seen in photographs. He felt like an intruder. A virus that had somehow found its way into the clean rooms of the body. They stopped outside a large, heavy wooden door. The woman knocked once, a sharp, clear rap. A voice from inside, calm and deep, said, "Come in." She opened the door for him and gestured for him to enter, then closed it behind him, leaving him alone. The office was enormous. It was a corner office, and 2 entire walls were made of floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city he thought he had been protecting. From up here, the cars looked like ants, and the people were just tiny, moving dots. All the noise, all the chaos, all the life of the streets was reduced to a silent, beautiful picture. It was a God's eye view. Behind a massive, polished oak desk sat David Vance. He was no longer in the simple blazer. He was wearing the formal dress uniform of the police commissioner. The dark blue wool was perfectly pressed, the creases sharp enough to cut paper. On his shoulders sat the gold insignia of his rank, gleaming under the soft, warm lighting of the office. He looked every bit the part that he was, the leader of thousands, the man in charge. He looked up as Dunn entered, and his face was unreadable. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look particularly disappointed. He looked at Dunn with the calm, analytical gaze of a scientist studying a specimen. "Officer Dunn," he said, gesturing to a simple wooden chair that sat in front of the imposing desk. "Please, sit." Dunn walked on legs that felt like they were made of lead. He sat down, the chair feeling even harder and more uncomfortable than the one in the interrogation room. He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he just clenched them in his lap. He kept his eyes fixed on the polished surface of the desk, unable to meet the commissioner's gaze. "I've reviewed the reports," Vance began, his voice quiet but filling the vast space. "I've watched the videos. I've heard the statements from the dozen or so civilians who stopped to record your performance." Dunn flinched at the word performance.
Oh.
It was so accurate, so cutting. "You saw a black man you believed you could intimidate," Vance continued, his tone still calm. "You saw a briefcase and a nice jacket, and you made an assumption. You used your badge and your uniform as a weapon to belittle a fellow citizen. The fact that I am your commissioner, the person you answer to, is an irony for the history books. But it is not the point." He finally leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk. "The crime you committed was not against me, officer. It was against this uniform. It was against the thousands of good, decent officers who go out every day and do their jobs with honor and respect. It was against the trust of every single person in that plaza who watched you abuse the power they gave you." Dunn could feel a hot prickle behind his eyes. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but his throat was tight. He knew that words were useless now. "I could fire you," Vance said, his voice dropping even lower. "It would be easy. I could write the report, and you would be gone. It would make a lot of people happy. It would send a message. Dunn held his breath. But that would be too easy for you, Vance said, a flicker of something cold and hard entering his eyes. Firing you lets you walk away. It lets you become a martyr in your own mind, a victim of political correctness. That is not justice. That is not a lesson. He opened a thin folder that was on his desk. You will not be fired. You are being suspended for 30 days without pay. You are being permanently demoted. You will no longer serve on patrol. You will be reassigned to the records division in the sub-basement. You will spend your days filing and digitizing cold cases. You will have plenty of time to think. He paused, letting the words sink in. A desk job in records was a purgatory for a street cop. It was a career death sentence, a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance. Furthermore, Vance went on, you will be enrolled in and you will successfully complete mandatory and intensive bias training, de-escalation workshops, and community service. You will not be allowed to return to any form of active duty until you have passed every single one. Your file will note this incident, and it will follow you for the rest of your career. Any promotion, any special assignment will be subject to this mark. He closed the folder and looked directly at Dunn, who was now shaking visibly. You will serve this city, officer, but you will do it from behind a desk in a basement, where the only authority you have is over a filing cabinet. You will have a long time to reflect on the power you so carelessly abused. You are dismissed. Dunn didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady. He couldn't form a sentence. He could only manage a choked, "Yes, sir," before turning and practically fleeing the office. The weight of his future pressing down on him so heavily he could barely breathe. As he walked out, he passed the deputy chief in the hallway. She didn't look at him. She just looked straight ahead, her face like stone. He was already a ghost. He was gone. The months that followed were a quiet, slow unraveling for Mike Dunn. The world didn't end with a bang. It faded away to the hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of old paper. The records department was indeed in the sub-basement of police headquarters, a place where the sun never reached and time seemed to stand still. It was a maze of tall gray metal shelves that created narrow, echoing aisles. The air was cool and still, heavy with the dust of forgotten cases. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple, short-sleeved department-tissued polo shirt and slacks. The badge that had once felt like a part of his body was now just a memory, and the weight of the gun on his hip was replaced by the light plastic feel of a barcode scanner. His new world was one of boxes and labels. He moved old files from one shelf to another, logged their contents into a computer system, and pushed a heavy cart up and down the endless aisles. The only sounds were the squeak of the cart's wheels, the hiss of the climate control, and the occasional distant siren that filtered down from the world above, a world he was no longer a part of at first. He was filled with a burning, bitter anger. He blamed the commissioner. He blamed his partner for not backing him up. He blamed the crowd for filming. He blamed the world. Every time he pushed the scanner's button and heard the confirming beep, he felt a surge of resentment. It was a constant, irritating reminder of his fall. But the anger was exhausting, and it had nowhere to go in the quiet, gray basement. It began to curdle into something else, a profound, soul-crushing shame. He would lie awake at night in his small apartment, the videos playing in his mind's eye. He saw the smug look on his own face, heard the mocking tone in his voice. He saw the quiet strength in Commissioner Vance's eyes, a strength that had only made his own weakness more obvious. The memory of it was a physical weight on his chest. He started to dread going to sleep because he knew he would have to face himself and his dreams. The mandated bias training was another kind of hell. It was held in a sterile classroom on one of the upper floors, and he sat in the back, avoiding eye contact. The instructors spoke of implicit bias, of subconscious assumptions, of the deep, hidden prejudices that people carry without even knowing it. They used case studies, and more than once, a scenario felt uncomfortably close to the plaza that had changed his life. He didn't speak. He just listened, and for the first time, he didn't listen with defiance. He listened with a sinking, terrifying feeling that they were talking directly about him. It was like a mirror being held up to the ugliest parts of his soul, and he was forced to look. He started to notice things. He saw the way the world treated the janitor who mopped the floors in the building. The way people would avoid eye contact or look through him as if he were invisible. He saw the way a young black man was followed by a security guard in a grocery store. A subtle but clear act of suspicion. These things had always been there, but he had never seen them before. Now, they were all he could see. His punishment wasn't just the desk job. It was the gift of a new and painful perspective. 6 months after the incident, a different kind of siren sound filled the air, the crisp, triumphant notes of a marching band. The police academy graduation was always a big deal. It was a day of celebration, a public promise of safety and service to the city. The main auditorium was filled to capacity. It was a sea of proud families in their Sunday best. Senior officers in their dress uniforms and rows of new recruits, sitting so straight and tall they seemed to be carved from wood on the stage. Behind a lectern adorned with the city seal stood Police Commissioner David Vance. He was in his full dress uniform again, but today it felt different. It wasn't the uniform of a judge handing down a sentence. It was the uniform of a leader inspiring his troops. The stage lights were warm, and when he looked out at the crowd, his expression was not unreadable, but open and full of purpose. He didn't start with a joke or a platitude. He started with a story. It wasn't the Plaza story, not directly. It was a story about a veteran officer he had known early in his career. A man who understood that the most powerful tool a police officer carried was not a gun or a baton, but their ability to listen. A badge and a uniform are a powerful thing, the commissioner said, his voice clear and resonant, easily filling the large room. They command attention. They grant you a level of authority that most people will never experience. But authority is a dangerous thing. It can feel like a drug. It can make you believe that you are more important than the people you serve. He paused, letting his eyes sweep over the faces of the new recruits. True leadership and true service is not about flexing that authority. It's about understanding its weight. It's about looking at a person who is having the worst day of their life and seeing not a problem to be managed, but a human being who needs help. It's about remembering that the person you meet on the street, whether they are in a car you just pulled over, or someone you pass on a corner, or someone who is living on the pavement, is a human being first. Your job is to protect that humanity, not to test it, not to judge it. He spoke of respect, not as something to be earned from the public, but as something to be given freely by the officer. Respect is the foundation upon which trust is built. And without trust, this badge is just a piece of metal. This uniform is just a costume. We are nothing. The camera, in a cinematic sense, would find a familiar face in the crowd. Seated in the front row, alongside other senior officers, sat Jenna Lopes. She now wore the single chevron of a sergeant on her uniform. Her back was straight, her chin was up. She was listening to the commissioner's words with an expression of deep, unwavering respect. She was a symbol of what could happen when you did the right thing, even when it was hard. She had been tested and had come out stronger. The commissioner concluded his speech with a call to a higher purpose. A challenge to the young men and women before him to be the kind of police officers the city needed. The applause was thunderous, a wave of appreciation and hope that washed over the auditorium. As the graduates stood to receive their diplomas, the scene was one of pure, unblemished pride. And then, the view would shift, dissolving from the bright, hopeful lights of the auditorium to the cold, artificial glow of a sub-basement. Deep below the celebrations, in the quiet, forgotten heart of the building, Mike Dunn sat at his small metal desk. A single bare bulb hung over his head, illuminating a stack of dusty case files waiting to be cataloged. He could almost hear the faint, muffled sound of the applause from a world away, a sound that was more painful than any siren. He picked up a file from the top of the stack. It was from a robbery that had happened 20 years ago. The victim's name, the witness statements, the evidence logit, was all a story from a time that felt impossibly distant. He opened the manila folder, the edges soft and frayed. He looked at the name on the first page, and for a moment he didn't just see a name. He saw a person who had lived and loved and feared and hoped. Just like him, he slowly reached for a label maker, a small plastic machine that was now his primary tool. He typed in the case number and pressed the print button. With a quiet whir, a strip of white plastic emerged, bearing the stark black letters. He peeled it off and carefully pressed it onto the spine of the folder. Then he stood up, carried the file to an aisle in the deep shadowy stacks, and slid it into its final resting place. He was a silent, living monument to the day he mocked a black man in public, not knowing he ran the entire department. His punishment wasn't the desk job or the loss of his badge. His punishment was that he now understood. And in the lonely, fluorescent quiet of the basement, that understanding was a life sentence.